Putin's Kursk gamble just backfired big time. For months, Ukraine has been locked in a brutal fight over Kursk, a region where it managed to capture 450 square miles in August 2024. Russia has since clawed back 40% of that territory in a counteroffensive, bolstered by 50,000 troops, including up to 12,000 North Koreans sent by Kim Jong-un. Putin wanted these foreign reinforcements to tip the scales, but instead, they're becoming part of the problem. Ukraine isn't playing defense anymore. President Volodymyr Zelensky has unleashed a bold new counteroffensive, turning the tables on Putin's forces. With surprise attacks across multiple fronts, Ukrainian troops aren't just holding the line, they're pushing to take back what's been lost. So what does this mean for Kursk, for Putin, and for the North Koreans sent into the grinder? We'll break it all down, starting with the news. On January 6th, CNN reported that Ukraine had spent the previous day launching a volley of counteroffensive assaults against Russian positions in Kursk. The news was confirmed by Andriy Kovalenko, the head of Ukraine's Center for Countering Disinformation, who told the outlet that Ukraine was launching surprise attacks throughout the border oblast. Much as it did with the initial Kursk invasion in August 2024, Ukraine was hoping that this surprise element would catch the Russians so off guard that they would be forced to cede territory. The strategy might be working. Posting to Telegram on January 5th, the head of the Ukrainian presidential office, Andriy Yermak, delivered a simple message. Kursk region, good news. Russia is getting what it deserves. Yermak provided no further details, though his message suggests that Ukraine had enjoyed at least some victories in its latest counteroffensive and that it would now start to push its advantage. Russia's defense ministry had the opposite message. While Yermak lauded the brave Ukrainian soldiers taking part in the counteroffensive and their supposed success, Russia claimed it had repelled the Ukrainian attackers. A defense ministry statement claimed Russia had taken decisive action, supported by artillery and aviation units. That action supposedly resulted in the destruction of the main Ukrainian forces that are gathered in the village of Berdyan, just 9 miles from the Ukrainian border, to prepare for the counteroffensive. Russia had prevented the Ukrainian armed forces from breaking through, claimed the ministry, suggesting that Yermak's Telegram post was false. Who's telling the truth? It's difficult to say at this point. CNN noted that it couldn't verify any of the battlefield reports relating to Ukraine's new counteroffensive at the time. However, we may get better insight from some of the Russian blogs posting about the attacks. CNN said that several of those blogs acknowledged the fighting that took place on January 5th and claimed that Ukraine's forces were pushing north to enter Berdyan. One blog claimed that Ukraine had thrown reserves into the new Kursk counteroffensive. It also noted that Ukraine had taken a clever approach to its counterattack. For the breakthrough, the AFU, or Armed Forces of Ukraine, covered the area with powerful radio-electronic warfare systems, hampering the work of Russia's unmanned aerial vehicles, claimed the blog. While pointing out that Russia's tanks and artillery are actively working against the enemy, the blog also said that most of the battles taking place involved small arms. Another Russian blog said that the fighting had started from the direction of Sudza and that Ukraine had landed paratroopers into the region to support its fighters. In this offensive, the enemy uses mine clearance trawls, tanks, and other armored vehicles, claimed the blogger. So the one thing we can say for certain is that the counteroffensive is underway. And the use of the word breakthrough by the first Russian blogger suggests that Ukraine has enjoyed a lot more success than Russia's defense ministry would like to have the world believe. More information about the counteroffensive comes from other sources. The Guardian's report on Ukraine's attacks included footage of armored columns making their way across snow-covered fields en route toward a village named Bolsho Soldatsko, situated just northeast of Sudza. This village appears to be a secondary target for Ukraine, suggesting that it has launched its counteroffensive on multiple fronts. That suggestion was essentially confirmed by Ukraine's General Staff, which claims that 42 combat clashes took place on January 5th, with 12 of those clashes continuing into the next day. The Guardian also says that there are unconfirmed reports that Ukraine's soldiers have entered Berdyan, along with making their way into another small town named Novosotnitsky. The Guardian also confirmed that Ukraine had used electronic countermeasures to take out Russian drones and that it had active sappers in the Kursk region removing Russian mines. These are not the sorts of reports we'd expect to hear if the Russian Defense Ministry's claims that it repelled the Ukrainian counteroffensive were accurate. And Ukraine is twisting the knife. In the Kursk region, the Russians are deeply concerned, claimed Andriy Kovalenko on January 5th. They were attacked on multiple fronts, which came as a surprise to them. This is far from the single attack near Berdyan that Russia has attempted to minimize the counteroffensive into. Ukraine is attacking in dozens of locations, with fighting ongoing in many of them and possible successful reclamation of territory in others. It also appears that Ukraine may be using British-made weapons in its counteroffensive. In its report on the Ukrainian counteroffensive, The Telegraph said that reports coming in from military bloggers suggested that the fighting was both fierce and, at times, somewhat confused. Amidst the armored columns Ukraine was sending into its assaults were British Challenger 2 tanks, claimed the bloggers. The Telegraph couldn't confirm those reports, but if they're accurate, Russia has a major piece of equipment to deal with. The Challenger 2 is a stalwart of the British Army, having seen use in engagements as varied as Kosovo, Iraq, and Bosnia. The first batch was built in 1986, with the 4-person crude tank being among the more modern that have taken to the field in the Ukraine war. It comes with a main L30A1 120mm rifled gun that can carry 47 rounds, along with a 7.62mm L94A1 chain gun that can rattle off fire at a terrifying rate. It's also a surprisingly speedy behemoth, with the tank being capable of traveling at up to 36.6 miles per hour, despite weighing 62.5 tons, more when it's loaded with its crew. If Ukraine is deploying these assets in Kursk, that tells us that it's serious about retaking at least some of the territory that it lost to Russia's own counteroffensive. The obvious question is simple: why is Ukraine engaging in this counteroffensive now? A small part of the answer relates to the conditions in Kursk at the time Ukraine launched its counteroffensive. Freezing winter weather in the oblast has made it difficult for Russia's ground forces to advance, while providing conditions that make it easier for Ukraine's armored units to move forward, according to The Guardian. Beyond the Challenger 2s, The Telegraph suggests there are also reports that Ukraine is using Bradley fighting vehicles in its advance, with those vehicles being used to ship the country's troops to positions quickly. Contrast that to Russia, which has been sending its infantry and North Korean troops to attack Ukraine's positions on foot, and you see a clear agility advantage for Ukraine. It's launching a counteroffensive now because it knows that a huge portion of Russia's troops are mired down in snow and ice, making them less able to respond. Speaking of Russia's North Korean troops and the Ukrainian advantage, there's another factor that plays into Ukraine's decision to counterattack now: Russia's casualty rates in Kursk. Our mention of Russia sending its soldiers to assault Ukraine on foot hints at the tactic Putin has relied upon so far during his Kursk counteroffensive. And it's the same tactic he's using inside Ukraine, sending wave after wave of cannon fodder at Ukrainian fortifications in the hope of exhausting the enemy's resources. These assaults have borne the fruit that everybody expects. Ukraine claims that in the 5 months between its initial Kursk invasion and the current counteroffensive, it's inflicted 38,000 casualties on Russia's forces. About 15,000 Russian troops have been killed in battle, with another 23,000 being injured. As if playing a childish game of tit-for-tat, Russia once again put out numbers to top the ones Ukraine released, claiming to have caused 49,010 troop casualties in Kursk during the same period. No details are provided about dead versus wounded, and it seems like an unusually high number, given how often Russia tries to minimize the numbers when it comes to how many Ukrainians are actually in Kursk. Russia is also losing a lot of the soldiers it's received from North Korean President Kim Jong-un as part of its collective defense treaty with its Asian ally. We mentioned earlier that Kim sent up to 12,000 of his soldiers, many reputed to be part of North Korea's elite Storm Corps, to Russia in October 2024. Zelensky reaffirmed that number during a January 2025 appearance on Lex Fridman's podcast, while adding that Ukraine has killed or wounded 3,800 North Korean soldiers. That's about a third of the entire contingent Kim has sent over, telling us that Ukraine has experienced plenty of success against Putin's biggest ally. In fact, the 2 days leading up to January 4th saw Ukraine destroy an entire battalion, comprised primarily of North Korean troops, according to Zelensky, suggesting that Kim's troops are experiencing casualties thick and fast. Why does this matter in the context of Ukraine's Kursk counteroffensive? Well, it all comes down to numbers. Ukraine has been chopping away at the 50,000-strong force Putin sent into Kursk to reclaim the territory. That brave defense has resulted in a weakened Russia. With fewer troops with which to launch attacks, Russian pressure may be waning, which has opened the door for Ukraine to launch counterattacks. There are now gaps in the Russian front line, or at least in areas where there are more scattered troops compared to those with rigid defenses. Ukraine has likely identified where Russia is weakest based on its casualty rate and used that information to hit Putin where it hurts. Where Russia's leader would have hoped that this human wave approach would break down Ukraine's defenses, he instead weakened his own to give his enemy more opportunities. Ukraine has taken those opportunities, and it now appears to be advancing into several of the small villages and towns that it lost to Russia's initial Kursk push. But there's more. Ukraine is also mindful of a massive event that's set to occur midway through January: the ascension of President-elect Donald Trump to the White House. Trump was another subject of Zelensky's conversation with Friedman. Ukraine's leader highlighted that Trump's security guarantees could lead to the end of the war in Ukraine, but only if Trump followed through on his promises. Zelensky also hinted at the fact that Trump appears to have enough leverage over Putin to at least force a ceasefire to the Russian leader's special military operation. For his part, Trump has claimed that he'll end the war within days of coming into office, with his much vaunted but ill-defined peace plan likely being the biggest card America's incoming president has to play. Zelensky knows this. He told Friedman that Trump and I will come to an agreement and offer strong security guarantees together with Europe, and then we can talk to the Russians. Whether Ukraine's leader actually believes this is up for debate. After all, he told French President Emmanuel Macron on December 30th that Ukraine needs to be realistic about its territorial issues and that there will be no quick and easy resolution to the war. Territorial issues is the key phrase relating to Ukraine's most recent counteroffensive. Theories abound about what Trump's plan will actually look like, but one of the most popular involves creating a massive demilitarized zone across the 745-mile front line of the Ukraine war. That zone will be patrolled by European troops. Polish, German, British, and French soldiers have all been suggested, with the US taking a hands-off approach. Both Ukraine and Russia would have to agree to the conditions of a ceasefire, with the zone preventing either from attacking the other. From there, peace plans could begin, with negotiations likely to revolve around the territory each country has. Russia currently holds about a fifth of Ukraine, with the majority of that territory being in the south and east. Putin's push in Donetsk, more on that later, could lead to Russia holding even more by the time that Trump comes to power. As for Ukraine, it has Kursk as leverage that it can use to reclaim some of the territory Russia has overrun during Putin's special military operation. So another reason for Ukraine's Kursk counteroffensive becomes clear. For as many soldiers as Putin has lost in his effort to retake Kursk, he's at least seeing some success. We mentioned earlier that Russia has already retaken about 40% of what it had lost to Ukraine's August 2024 invasion. Ukraine's counteroffensive is an attempt to retake at least a portion of that lost territory, so that it has as much leverage as possible if and when Trump brings it to the table with Russia. And Kursk holds a lot of value for Putin. Though smaller in the context of how much territory Russia has snatched from Ukraine, Kursk still represents the first time that Russia has been invaded successfully since World War II. Leaving it in Ukrainian hands, even if that means trading Kursk for much more territory inside Ukraine, will be a black eye for Putin. He may be willing to trade more of Ukraine than he gets in return for Kursk to soothe his humiliation. Zelensky will be banking on that, which is one of the reasons we're now seeing Ukraine push to reclaim territory in Kursk. He's creating pressure for Putin. And that brings us to another reason why Ukraine has chosen now to counterattack in Kursk. Fellow of the American think tank Yorktown Institute Robert Clark affirms that Ukraine intends to use any territory it has in Kursk as a bargaining chip later on. However, he also notes that Putin has committed a lot of his reputation amongst his own people to the success or failure of Russia's current efforts in Kursk. Clark says Ukraine's latest move will mean a huge deal more to Putin than it will to Trump in the context of peace talks. Putin has told the Russian people over the Christmas period that he will return all of Kursk to Russia. So the ability for Putin to really retain control of Kursk is going to be far more important to him and to Russia than it will be to President Trump going forward. Again, it's the humiliation aspect we mentioned earlier. Putin is under pressure from his people and perhaps forces in the Kremlin that have taken Kursk as a sign of weakness, thanks to what Ukraine is doing. Reclamation of the Russian land lost becomes a whole lot harder when Ukraine is actively taking territory back, along with defending what it still holds. Times Radio's international correspondent Alex Cadier agrees. He says that Ukraine's counteroffensive bucks the narrative of the last few months, in which Russia has been slowly retaking territory in Kursk. And again, that creates pressure for Putin. It shows him that even with the massive manpower advantage that comes courtesy of having North Korean troops, Ukraine's forces still have the capacity to punch back. And these heavy punches will stack even more pressure onto Putin, Cadier claims. It's certainly significant in the amount of resources that have been put into it, Cadier says when referring to Ukraine's counteroffensive. But also, it will have very serious diplomatic consequences if and when these ceasefire talks happen. So it all seems to have worked out well for Ukraine. Wintry conditions gave it the mobility advantage it needed to launch the counteroffensive in the first place. Having enjoyed so much success in terms of pure Russian and North Korean casualty rates only added to the opportunity that winter delivered, as it created gaps for Ukraine to exploit. And with Donald Trump soon to become president, Ukraine is taking every chance it gets to grab territory and pile pressure onto an already weakened Putin, both domestically and in terms of upcoming peace talks. There's also the matter of Donetsk to consider. While all of this fighting in Kursk is going on, Russia is pushing hard to claim as much territory in Ukraine's east as possible. Russia is advancing through that region at the fastest rate it's managed in terms of territorial acquisitions since February 2022 and the initial invasion. Putin's troops are on the verge of flanking the Donetsk city of Pokrovsk and have forced the abandonment of key Ukrainian defensive positions. These include an underground stronghold in a ruined thermal power plant that Ukraine has spent most of the war defending. These advances won't have escaped Zelensky's notice. In fact, some commentators have even criticized Ukraine's actions in Kursk, with that criticism likely to intensify in the wake of the counteroffensive. Critics suggest that Ukraine will be better served committing the troops it has stationed in Kursk to the Donetsk defense, thus slowing the Russian advance. The Ukraine military's commander-in-chief Alexander Syrsky says otherwise, claiming that the entire Kursk operation has forced Russia to divert troops it would have sent to Donetsk. By launching its counteroffensive in Kursk, Ukraine hopes to keep these troops committed and perhaps push Moscow into diverting more, so it can stem the flow of losses in Donetsk while it retakes chunks of Kursk. The question now is simple: will Ukraine's Kursk counteroffensive succeed? It's a little too early to tell, as the operation is still ongoing. However, Ukraine does have a history of failed counteroffensives during Putin's special military operation. In the summer of 2023, Ukraine attempted a counteroffensive in southern and eastern Ukraine to take back land snatched up during the initial invasion. That counteroffensive stalled out, meaning Ukraine failed in its attempt to sever the connection between Russia-controlled Crimea and the Ukrainian mainland. Could this counteroffensive in Kursk suffer the same fate? It's possible, though the conditions are far different. In the summer of 2023, Ukraine spent several months building up the forces and weaponry it needed to launch its counteroffensive. That gave Russia plenty of time to prepare, allowing Putin's forces to create layered defenses across the front line. Trenches and mines were laid in strategic areas, all of which slowed the Ukrainian attack to a crawl, allowing Russia to mostly defend its captured territory. That's not what's happening during Ukraine's Kursk counteroffensive. Ukraine launched surprise assaults this time around. It's still targeting multiple points along the front line, just as it did in summer 2023, but it's doing so without giving the Russian forces a chance to prepare. Ukraine is also attacking while Russia is in mid-attack itself, again eliminating the defensive mindset that allowed Putin's forces to successfully repel the summer 2023 counteroffensive. There's also the possibility that the current Kursk counteroffensive might be diversionary. The BBC reports that a handful of Russian military bloggers have speculated as much, with Yuri Podloyarka suggesting Ukraine's current attacks may be diverting Russia away from a larger attack to come. Alexander Kots, another Russian blogger, seems to agree, claiming that a main attack may be launched elsewhere while Russia is preoccupied with Ukraine's smaller attacks. Perhaps Ukraine has something bigger lined up for Russia. If that's the case, it casts Russia's claims of having quelled at least portions of the Ukrainian counteroffensive into a new light. Perhaps Russia was meant to have deflected those smaller attacks. Ukraine may be poking the bear, inflicting casualties along the way as it prepares for a heavier push against a weakening Russia in Kursk. That all remains to be seen. For now, we want your opinions on the Ukrainian Kursk counteroffensive. Is this Ukraine's last gasp attempt to hold on to land before Trump becomes president? Is a larger Ukrainian attack coming? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video.